This is a series that I've been doing in Sunday school for the men's class. Um, Unfortunately, we've been unable to meet for the last few weeks thanks to the virus outbreak. Um, but I don't want us falling behind or forgetting what all we've talked about. Plus, I've been putting my lessons as I can get them up onto YouTube. It's just a good way for me to be able to review. It's a good way to share with those who might be interested as well. If anybody misses, I'm currently working through this series that's going to be starting now that I have another recording device, as well as continuing through Revelations, which we will be continuing when this particular study finishes. I've got another series that I'm working on that I'm looking forward to. But this particular series, just to go ahead and get started with it, came from Sermonary. Sermonary is a website that offers various tools for studying the Bible, and they had some free items that they released on Facebook. And when I see free stuff and studying the Bible, I go ahead and grab it. I don't know whether it'll be any good or not, but you don't know until you look. So, sure, went ahead and tried it. And this particular free set was called Bible Book Summaries Gospels. And I thought, well, this could be interesting because I am a novice when it comes to studying the Bible, especially when it comes to studying it a little bit deeper. Uh, but some of the things that you run across get really confusing. And this one introduced an issue known as the synoptic gospel problem. And I had never heard of that before. And I thought, well, what is it? And the synoptic gospel problem is a issue that comes up when you try to align the four gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, because people say there are discrepancies, there are conflicts, there are contradictions. And I don't believe that the Bible has any contradictions. I don't believe there are conflicts within it. And so I was like, let's see. Let's see what it says. Let's try to put them together. And the synoptic problem is mostly Matthew, Mark, and Luke because they are so similar and yet different, while John has 93% of the book that is not in any of the other three, according to this study. So it's not usually an issue in the synoptic problem. All four Gospels are accounts of Jesus' life and ministry, though, and it's aggravating when people say it's a problem. When I was looking in Revelations and was teaching that in Sunday school, we saw one such issue when we were talking about the church of Thyatira, and that is Mark and John, say that the robe Jesus wore during his trial was purple, but Matthew calls it scarlet. And the question comes up, well, was it purple or was it scarlet? And people really nitpick this stuff sometimes. There was a hue, it turns out, back then that Thyatira was known for, called Thyatira red. And it is what we would consider a red, but it was a very dark red. And it was known as poor man's purple. So you've got this purple that is also red. Purple to signify the crime of Jesus being a king. Red, though, so that it's not as expensive. Because purple was very expensive of a dye back then. That's at least a year's worth of wages. So you wouldn't put a purple robe on a criminal that you're scourging and is going to have blood all over their back, because then you're going to ruin this purple cloak, this very expensive cloak. Taxpayers aren't going to like that. I don't care if it's nowadays or 2,000 years ago. Tax people are going to get mad about it. So you have Thyatira red. It's a purple cloak, but it's not as expensive. And it's technically red. So Matthew, being a tax collector, would definitely know that this purple cloak is technically a red dye. And so there becomes this, well, it's two different words, but it's the same dye. It was just depending upon your amount of learning and your visual perception of color. I don't always see all the correct reds and greens and colors. I'm not colorblind, but I have trouble with certain hues. Like I'll see a color and I'll be like, oh, that's blue. And they're like, no, that's green. That's a shade of green. That's orange. No, that's red. And so it comes down to that this is a red dye that was viewed as a purple. But we'll get more into that when we get there. So when people bring this up in terms, they would say stuff like, why do the Gospels contradict one another? And they don't really. And when I was looking up the responses for, well, how do people address this? Here's what I found. There's a lot of ways people address it, and I don't like any of them. Matthew and John were disciples. Mark was connected to Peter, and Luke was a historian. That's the part I'm going to go from. But here's what the learned responses said. They had special revelations from God. The Gospel of the Nazarenes is the original source, but that was written by another person. That's a fifth gospel that we don't have anymore. And that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John copied from it and omitted whatever they didn't like. Okay, that's human error, and that's also saying that there is non-canonical material within the Bible, or that the Bible is not complete. Both of those are wrong, so I don't understand why these learned people try to say that one. Some people say that Mark wrote first and that Matthew and Luke copied from them. Well, then you have the issue of they found new research showing that Matthew was written before Mark. We have an earlier copy of Matthew than the earliest copy of Mark now. So, did Mark write it first? Did Matthew write it first? Does it really matter? Does it really matter? Some critics get complicated in that they apply oral tradition to written words and assume that this is a primitive society and that the Gospels don't actually include everything that happened. Again, that would mean the Bible's incomplete. Redaction critics claim that the Gospels are altered versions of what transpired so that it matches the writer's personal theology. I'm sorry, the Bible says it's God-breathed, not man-breathed. And if it is man, there's going to be discrepancies. And we're going to find as we go through this series, there's not. Spoiler alert, there's not. One of the main theories out there currently is literary criticism, which analyzes the text in terms of structure, emphasis, and unique features. It seeks to understand the canonical text as a piece of literature by examining how the writer wrote it. Yeah, I'm a normal person. I don't speak like that. I don't even understand what they're saying when they're talking about it's a piece of literature. It's more than that. Why are you trying to treat it like it's just a common storybook? Now, almost all of the background for this particular study's out of the way. But there's one more piece of information, so just bear with me. We're almost ready to start. Just a couple more things to explain, and then you'll hopefully understand where all this is coming from. Each gospel has its own viewpoint. And this was something that I learned going through this study. The viewpoints are as follows. Matthew wrote to the Jews stressing that Jesus is king, because the Jews did not see him as the king. They saw him as someone who claimed. Mark wrote to the Romans showing Jesus was the servant, because the Romans thought he came to usurp. They were told he was a king trying to usurp their authority, but he was the servant. Luke wrote to the Greeks showing Jesus was man. The Greeks saw what Jesus said and what he did, the miracles he performed, and they attributed him to some form of deity. And they're right, but they did not believe that he was God come as man. They just saw him as a deity, as this like demigod, instead of what he truly was. They didn't understand the man part of him. And John wrote to the Gentiles showing Jesus was God, because the Gentiles saw him and said, no, that's Jesus, son of Joseph, the carpenter's boy. He was just a boy. Sure, he did some really amazing stuff, but he was just a guy. They didn't understand the God part of it. So all four wrote to different audiences who had a different background knowledge and experience with Jesus, and they were each clarifying a different issue that those four audiences had while never once contradicting each other, which is really difficult to do for anything that's man-made. That all said, I created this timeline. I synthesized these using a research-based design. I designed this using what I looked up from the CIA, the FBI, and literary sources, firsthand, secondhand, how you attribute them to each other. Because Matthew and John were there with Jesus. Mark and Luke were not. Mark, historically, because that's the best we can go off of, got his account from Peter. So his is a single second-hand account. We have reason to believe that Mark was someone who listened to Jesus firsthand, but he was not necessarily there traveling with him. He was a person who stayed at home with his mother, and they listened to stories about Jesus. That is another theory that is out there, but it is believed the best way that we can get all this is he got his account from Peter, because there was stuff that's in his account that were before he met Jesus. So where did he get that from? From Peter, who he traveled with later. Luke got his material from a lot of different sources as he was researching the case of Jesus for the Theophilus who was sponsoring him. And we can talk more. That's a whole nother thing to get into. So I gave more emphasis to Matthew and John because they're first-hand accounts. And if I tell somebody something directly or I see something, it's a lot easier to have it completely 100% accurate. I'm not talking about factuality. I'm talking about timeline-wise. Whereas if I'm learning from somebody, Mark learning from Peter, well, Peter's going to teach Mark what Mark needs to know as he needs to know it. So if something comes up ahead of time in Mark, how do you align that to Matthew? Well, first of all, it's a second-hand account, so you don't take second-hand accounts for timeline per se. You take second-hand accounts and compare them to first-hand accounts to fact-check the first-hand accounts. And so Peter tells Mark a few things that are out of order, probably because Mark needed to know that at that time, not because, hey, Mark, this is when this happened. It's okay, you're going through this and you need to know this now. Luke, on the other hand, gets his from a lot of different sources. He's not going to know what order anything goes in. So when you look at Luke, you'll find his is the most disorganized as far as comparing it to when something happens in any of the other three Gospels. The only parts that are really solid in the second-hand accounts are the beginning and the end. The middle gets very jumbled up, Luke even more so, because again, they weren't there. They don't know when things happen. They don't know the order. But they give us insights because they are accounts that came from others, and they help us fact-check the beginning, the events of the first-hand accounts. And so all of them are important. And so we're going to be using it as if you research this and you looked at when things occurred, where do they go? Is there discrepancy? Second-hand accounts, not necessarily for timeline, but fact-checking the events of the first-hand accounts, which will create our timeline. Whew. Okay, I think that's just about all the notes except for what translation am I reading out of. I like the KJV. It's what I'm comfortable with reading from. I grew up with the KJV, but the KJV is not grammatically accurate for English anymore, and so it gets a little confusing. The KJV also has quite a few words that were translated a very rudimentary way. In fact, in the KJV, earlier copies of it, my wife showed me an early copy of it, it says, "We hope somebody will come along when translations get better, when we understand the language better and translate it again, simply so that there's a better understanding. As such, I'm going to be reading the DLNT version, which is the Disciples Literal New Translation, just because I have to translate less Greek that way. I have to retranslate less that way. Plus, it's in a little bit more of a grammatical proper method. There's still some spots that are a little weird, like it'll say the one instead of whom it's referring to. But that's the worst it gets usually. There are a few other words, again, I'll have to translate because when Jesus tells one of the apostles, "Get behind me, Satan," he's not calling him the name Satan. He's giving him the word that is Satan. And that name actually has a meaning because it was a word that was attributed to something else. It is a quality. Just like Jesus has many names, they show his qualities. God has many names given in the Bible to show his qualities. Satan is a name for Lucifer, showing a quality. And it's a very, very accurate quality when we get to that word. So when we get to those spots, I will, again, be kind of retranslating them simply because it's important to know what Jesus is actually telling to his apostle there. Instead of "Get behind me, Satan," he's saying "Get behind me," and then what the word actually means. But we'll get to that when we get to that. So starting off, we'll just do a couple of verses here for our introduction. We'll start with Luke 1 through 4, because Luke states the purpose of the Gospels very nicely. He says, "Inasmuch as many undertook to compile a narrative about the things having been fulfilled among us, just as the eyewitnesses from the first and ones having become servants of the word handed down to us, it seemed good to me also, having closely followed everything carefully from the beginning, to write it for you, in order, most excellent Theophilus, in order that you may fully know the certainty of the things about which you were instructed." So Luke writes to Theophilus and tells him, this is for you in order that you might understand it. And it's not in order that you might understand it as in a chronological event, but the purpose of it. Just as Luke wrote to the Theophilus, these Gospels are written so that we may fully understand and know the certainty of the things we believe about Jesus. John 1 through 5 gives us the first account of Jesus. John 1 through 5 says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. This one was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and apart from him not even one thing came into being which has come into being. In him was life, and the life was the light of mankind. And the light is shining in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it." I want to show one particular thing in this verse, in verse 4. "In him was life, and the life was the light of mankind." That word life is the word Zoe, which means physical present life and spiritual future life. John stresses already in the first 5 verses that Jesus and God were one, that they gave us a physical life, and that only through Jesus could we receive restoration to our future spiritual life. If you look in Genesis, you'll find there are 3 lives that are talked about being breathed into mankind. That is a great topic that our pastor, Brother Wurgis, talks about. He's much better versed into it. Our associate pastor gets into it. They're better on that topic. That's a much deeper topic, and I encourage you to ask people about it, because the Hebrew there gives you a lot of interesting insights that, there are words in there that are plural that were translated singular, and it changes everything when you realize that they're actually plural. But here, Jesus was with God. This is before everything. And John tells about that. Even Luke talks about before Jesus comes into the physical realm as a man. In Luke 1:5 through 25, it says, "There was a certain priest, Zachariah by name, from the division of Abijah, and a wife for him from the daughters of Aaron. And her name was Elizabeth. And they were both righteous ones in the sight of God, walking in all the commandments and regulations of the Lord as blameless ones. and there was not a child for them because Elizabeth was barren, and they were both advanced in their days. And it came about during his serving as priest before God in the order of his division, that according to the custom of the priestly office, he obtained by lot that he might offer incense after having entered into the temple of the Lord. So this goes to show what Zechariah's position is. He is one of them who can go in to offer incense. So he's got this little belt on with bells and a rope so that if something happens because he wasn't purified and he wasn't right before he walked into that spot, he would get struck dead and they would have to pull him out. And that gives you a little bit of understanding as to why they're waiting for him a couple verses down. While he's in there, it says, and the whole assembly of the people was praying outside at the hour of the offering incense. Because remember, only one was allowed in. And an angel of the Lord appeared to him, standing on the right side of the altar of incense. And having seen him, Zechariah was frightened, and fear fell upon him. But the angel said to him, do not be fearing, Zechariah, because your prayer was heard. And your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you shall call his name John. And there will be joy and gladness for you, and many will rejoice over his birth. For he will be great in the sight of the Lord, and he will never drink wine and fermented drink. And he will be filled with the Holy Spirit while still of his mother's womb. And that's important because that's going to happen in a few verses. And he will turn back many of the sons of Israel to their Lord, their God. And he will go ahead before him, and that's capital him, that is a proper him, in the spirit and power of Elijah, to turn back the hearts of the fathers to their children, to turn back disobedient ones with the understanding of righteous ones, to prepare a people having been made ready for the Lord. That is an Old Testament prophecy that says there will be a forerunner making way, the way of God, preparing the way. And we'll get to that when we get to where John is doing that. And Zechariah said to the angel, based on what shall I know this? For I am an old man, and my wife is advanced in her days. And having responded, the angel said to him, I am Gabriel, the one standing in the presence of God. And I was sent forth to speak to you and to announce these things as good news to you. And behold, you shall be silent and not be able to speak until which day these things take place, because you didn't believe my words, which will be fulfilled in their proper time. And the people were waiting for Zechariah, waiting to see whether he got to offer the incense or not. And they were wondering during his delaying in the temple. And having come out, he was not able to speak to them. And they realized that he had seen a vision in the temple. And he was motioning to them and continuing to be mute. And it came about, when the days of his service were fulfilled, he went to his house. And after these days, Elizabeth, his wife, conceived. And she was concealing herself for 5 months, saying that, thus the Lord has done for me in the days in which he looked upon me, to take away my reproach among people. So an angel appears to Zechariah, tells him what's about to happen, and then Zechariah does the man thing. He opens his mouth and puts his foot in it. How will I know this? An angel just appeared, just told him, and he has to ask. So the angel made him not to be able to speak. But that served a second purpose. That made it so that everybody outside knew something special had just happened and that they needed to pay attention to Zechariah, because he had something to tell them once he finally would be able to speak. They knew he had seen something. We'll pick up next time in the next verses with Luke 1:26 through 38, and we'll see what happens with the next message from Gabriel.